Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to this talk. Apologies, it's another recording. I'm away travelling at the moment, so I have no option but to provide a recording. I'm going to talk about the population status and ecology of Marsupella profunda in Britain, which isn't too far away from where you're all sat presently. To start with, here's an overview of its world distribution. It has a very localized distribution for a bryophyte. It's known from the China clay region of Cornwall, where it was discovered by Jean Peyton. That was published in a paper in Journal of Bryology in 1990. But it was first described long before that by Lindbergh in 1887 from material collected in North Portugal. And it's still presently known from a cluster of sites in North Portugal and in Central Portugal. And in addition, there are also populations known from Micronesia. Firstly, it's known from a single collection by Alan Crundwell from the Azores. And it's known from a cluster, 3 or 4 recent collections from Madeira. And then there's a question mark about the Canary Islands. There was a specimen collected by Derl from Palma in 1978, which he sent to Giri Vanya. Giri Vanya thought that it was likely to be profunda, but he wasn't entirely sure. The specimen itself appears to have been lost, as it isn't in Derl's herbarium, which is located in Stuttgart. So that's why there's a question over the Canary Islands. So if any of you happen to be bryologizing in the Canary Islands at any point, please keep a lookout for Marsupella profunda. With regards to conservation designations, there's a plethora of designations surrounding this species. I've listed them here in kind of importance with regards to the significance in the context of England. So firstly, it's specially protected under Schedule 8 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act, which provides every single shoot of the species with special legal protection against damage. It's also listed on Annex 2 of the Habitats Directive, which has meant the designation of SACs specifically for this species. It's listed on Section 41 of the NERC Act, which means that it's of principal importance for conservation in England, and that has various implications with regard to where money is spent and with regards to what monitoring is done, what sites are designated, etc. It's also listed as endangered on the IUCN Red List of bryophytes in Britain, and this has implications because in particular critically endangered species become priorities for conservation action. This list in particular is used by our conservation agencies. And the last two aren't of great relevance with regards to what's practically done on the ground in England. It's listed as vulnerable on the World IUCN Red List, and it's listed on Appendix 1 of the Berne Convention. The latter merely requires governments to take special measures to ensure its special protection, but that's already enacted through these first 2 elements of legislation at the top of this list. So it's incidental that it's listed on Appendix 1 of the Berne Convention. With regards to its identification, this isn't a particularly aesthetically pleasing photograph, but it does illustrate the character of the species very well. Firstly, this general chestnut brown coloration is very typical of the species. It can be a bit greener in more shady locations, but generally speaking, when it's hydrated, it has this chestnut brown coloration. When it's dehydrated, it can often look blackish, but this is typically what it looks like when it's wet. But the details to look at, I'll just point to this leaf here, for example. You can see that it has a plain leaf margin. There's no recurvature of the leaf margin at all. And it's also rounded at the tip. So these two features, plain leaf margin with a rounded leaf lobe, is highly characteristic of profunda. And you can see it's very well illustrated here on these other photographs here. Oh, these are the leaves. The main lookalike in Britain is what we call sprucei. I've put it in inverted commas here because the sprucei we have in the China clay pits is genetically different from the sprucei in continental Europe. And the type location for sprucei is from continental Europe, it's not from the UK. So it may be the sprucei the plants that we name as sprucei in the clay pits are in fact an undescribed species, but that's work that needs to be undertaken. Ignore the difference in colour here, although generally sprucei is a greener plant. It's not usually this marked, the colour difference. The key difference, if you look at the leaf tip here, I hope that's visible in the presentation, excuse me. You can see the leaf tips are pointed. It's clear here on this leaf tip, and generally when you look across the leaf tips here, they're all clearly pointed, whereas they're rounded in profunda. And that's a clear difference you can see with certainly with a 20 times hand lens, and perhaps also with a 10 times lens. I don't use a 10 times lens, so I don't know, but certainly it's something visible, clearly visible with 20 times. So onto its habitat requirements. So it absolutely loves kaolinized granite. And this is altered granite. It isn't your usual hard granite that we know very well from the uplands of Britain. Kaolinized granite has gone through a transformation process. I've got a piece of it here. I'll hold it up to the camera, see if you can see it a bit better. I'll wait for the oh, there we go. So you can see I can pick pieces off. It's really soft, you know, it just falls to pieces in my hand. And the reason for this is that the feldspar minerals, which used to be a large part of the matrix of the rock, have been transformed into kaolinite. Kaolinite is the china clay, the kaolin. So it's now mostly quartz grains is the hard part of the rock that's left, and that they're enclosed within a matrix of china clay, of kaolin. So you get this altered soft granite rock, which Marsupella profunda and many other of the small liverworts that co-occur absolutely love. So this is a kaolin boulder, soft granite boulder here, and it's surrounded by unaltered hard granite, and you can see that the bryophytes absolutely love it, including here the dark purple is all Marsupella profunda. So I would estimate that approximately, roughly speaking, 90% of the population of Marsupella profunda is on these kaolinized soft granite boulders. It does occur on the harder granite as well, but it's much more scarce on the hard granite, and the niche in which it occurs is also a bit more localized. It needs particularly sheltered locations. There's lots of hard granite about in the china clay pits, but the microclimate is much more specific with regards to when Marsupella profunda occupies it. It needs to be more sheltered, and it clearly doesn't like the hard granite so much. And then, much more rarely, over on the right here, you can see a colony of profunda. This is on the bed of a mica dam. So this is mostly clay substrate with some quartz grains mixed in, and this has become baked, and it kind of is quite similar to the kaolinized granite in some situations. And the liverwort sometimes but rarely occurs in such situations. With regards to exposure, the species prefers, it doesn't occur under heavy shade, under scrub for example, and it doesn't occur in strongly exposed microhabitats, such you can see on the right here. So there are soft granite boulders scattered through this china clay waste here, but there's no Marsupella profunda on it, and indeed very little other stuff on it. And it's just too exposed. It's windy up here on the china clay pits, and it's strongly exposed to sunlight all day. It's just too dry. So it likes this in between, not too shaded, not too exposed. So north-facing banks are perfect for it. And it also requires reasonably regular disturbance. So it's a brilliant colonizer. This soft granite boulder here, the dark purple is the Marsupella profunda. These seta are hundreds of sporophytes of the profunda. Each of the sporophytes, in each capsule, there are around about 100,000 spores, and it has tiny spores for a bryophyte. They're about 8 microns wide, so really small. And it produces literally billions of spores during particularly the winter period. January, February, March time is peak spore release. So it colonizes, rapidly undergoes its life cycle, and then pumps out billions of spores to find new, fresh, soft granite substrate. It's quickly excluded by other leafy liverworts. So on this boulder, this pale green plant is Marsupella emarginata, and that's the chief species which occurs with and which overgrows it. Other leafy liverworts also frequently overgrow it, including Diplophyllum albicans, Nardia scalaris, and Scarpania compacta. So it's very, very intolerant of competition, and that's why it needs this disturbance. So the three things are soft granite, reasonably sheltered microclimate, and occasional disturbance. So the following slides, I'm going to talk about its distribution and population size. The work I did started off by compiling an inventory of sites where the species has been recorded from, all of the sites it's been recorded from in Britain. They're all confined to Cornwall. Then in 2022, I surveyed all of those sites in West Cornwall, which comprise a total of 6 sites, and all of the sites within the Syntostal clay pits, SAC. This is just, in reality, this is 3 tiny areas within the Syntostal clay pits region. And then I reviewed and summarised all of the other survey work I've done and which David Holyoke has done within the Syntostal china clay region. So this is a large area of china clay pits, and I've been surveying parts of it since 2011. Lots of separate little contracts here and there. So I reviewed all of that, and I'll present the results of that. So when I go about recording the population size and distribution within a particular area, I search all potential habitat within a survey area, and when I come across a colony of the species, I take a GPS waypoint of that colony, and then I ignore any other further colonies that are within 1 meter distance of that colony I've just logged. And then I continue around a survey area until I've covered all of the accessible habitat that looks as though it may contain colonies of the species. And then each of the waypoints I consider to be a separately occupied 1 meter grid cell, and each of those I consider to be an individual equivalent. So this follows the IUCN guidance published by the Bryophyte Specialist Group, whereby it's a compromise with regards to counting individuals when it comes to bryophytes. It's a practical way of getting an overall index of population size. So this right-hand image here shows the results of a survey I've done. The red polygon is the survey boundary, so this is the area I've been asked to look at. The orange squiggly line is my survey route on the day, and the red points are GPS locations of Marsupella profunda. So its overall distribution pattern then with regards to occupied monads, so it's been recorded in 41 monads in total in Cornwall. The main cluster here is the Saint-Austell China clay region. And then there's records over here from West Cornwall. It's gone from most of those now. 6 monads, it's become extinct, and in West Cornwall survives in a single monad, which I'll go on to provide details of. What I'm going to do now is overlay China clay pits onto this map. So these red dots here are China clay quarries and workings right back from the earliest history of China clay quarrying in Cornwall, which began at Tregonning Hill here in the 17th century. So you can see there's been quite a lot of China clay quarrying here. This is the Bodmin Moor granite. I've never looked for it here, but David Holyoke did a lot of looking for it here and never found it. He thought they were too exposed for it. If you look at aerial imagery, there's still quite a lot of potential habitat there, at least judging by aerial imagery. And whilst David will have done a thorough job, it may be worth revisiting some of these just to check if there's been any subsequent colonisation. Over in South Devon here on the Dartmoor granite, things become a lot more uncertain. The China clay quarrying on the higher ground here, there's no suitable habitat. These are all very old quarries and have become overgrown. But here, close to Plymouth, and over here, we have a lot of active China clay quarrying, and the species could well be here. But they're all active pits, they're all fenced off, there's no public access, and they're all patrolled. So there's no way of presently surveying these pits to see whether the Marsupella profunda is present. But that's the biggest question mark with regards to its overall distribution pattern in Britain, is whether it occurs here on the Dartmoor granite. Go on to talk about the SACs a bit. So there are 3 SACs, which are actually 6 separate sites. There are 2 over here, the Lower Bostrays and Leswidden SAC, shown in red, Tregonning Hill SAC, shown in blue, and then the Saint-Austell Clay Pits SAC, these 3 separate black points over in East Cornwall. This is the first part of the first SAC. This is at Leswidden. And what the SAC comprises here is basically this China clay spoil bank here. So this was cleared in 1982, or rather created in 1982, from old China clay spoil from the adjacent China clay pit. The adjacent China clay pit has been disused for a long time. It's all overgrown. There's no profunda there. But this China clay spoil was re-exposed when this coal yard was built. Marsupella profunda colonised the site, and it was monitored since 1996 by David Holyoke. It became incorporated, it became designated as an SAC in 2005, but despite various small-scale management, the last record was in 2009 and it was extinct by 2011 due to vegetation succession. Very nearby across the road, this is Lower Bostrays Pit. This was the last quarry to be quarried for china clay in West Cornwall. It closed in 1991. David Holyoake first found it here, and it was monitored more or less annually from 1996 to 2011. It became designated as an SAC in 2005, specifically for the species. And as you can see, since its discovery here, vegetation succession has progressed substantially, despite some efforts to try to control it. So these red arrows here show locations where the species was known from in 1996. It's a photograph of David Holyoake's. It's known on the boulder bank at the base of the quarry here and on this quarry bench at the top. And it's gone from both of those by 2022 due to encroachment by scrub at the top and by willow at the bottom. It still survives here over on the right, and I'll show an image of that area now. So it continues to survive on boulders here, along here, and there's 49 individual equivalents. But it's in decline due to vegetation succession. This is the last known colony of the species surviving in West Cornwall, and I suspect it will be gone within the next 10 to 20 years due to vegetation succession. On to Tregonning Hill SAC, these are two adjacent quarries. Quarry closed here in 1905, but I think there must have been some subsequent activity. No records of any management for Marsupella profunda. It was monitored regularly here by David Holyoake, but the last record was in 2003 and he confirmed its extinction by 2004. There have been several subsequent searches, including by me. I've been looked on 3 occasions now, and it's gone from this site. The pits are completely filled with willow scrub. On to the St Austell Clay Pits SAC, 3 separate units to this. This is a part of Barl Pit, so this is a tiny area that's designated an SAC, 0.3 hectares. This is a photograph from David Holyoake, 1999, showing a location of the species. And this is the same view of that location in 2022. This is approximately the area where the species occurred. It's extinct from this particular view largely due to rhododendron succession. Elsewhere further down the slope here, it continues to persist, but in tiny amounts, 3 individual equivalents and declining. And I suspect it will be gone from this part of the SAC within the next 5 to 10 years at most. The second part of this St Austell Clay Pits SAC is Prosper Pit. Another photo from David Holyoake, 1999, showing a location of occupied, and the same view in 2022. As you can see, it's a clear story developing here. Vegetation succession here, mainly due to willow scrub encroachment. And the species was last seen here in 2011, and it became extinct sometime before 2022. Last part of the this particular SAC, Goonveen Pit, another tiny area. Another photograph from David Holyoake, occupied boulders here. The view of the area in 2022, willow scrub has caused its extinction. And again, some attempts at controlling vegetation succession were undertaken here, including the cutting of removal of scrub by contractors in 2006. And it had become extinct sometime between 2011 and 2022. So a quick summary of its status within the SACs. 6 sites in all. It's extinct within 4 of them. Tiny population remaining in 1, where it'll become extinct very soon, and a larger population surviving in Lower Bustrays Pit, but I think it'll be extinct there within the next 10 to 20 years, all due to vegetation succession. Onto the core area for the species, the wider syntostral clay pit region. So the SAC, as I've said, is 3 tiny parts of this region. But the region itself is enormous, 42 kilometers squared, and here you can clearly see it with Google imagery. This is Syntostal Town here, this is Bodmin, this is Newquay, and this is the China clay region. Massive area. The turquoise lagoons you can see here are disused pits which have become flooded. The white areas are those areas where there is current or recent China clay quarrying and the tipping of the waste. And this is a view across part of the region. This is Little John's Pit, which is an area just around here where that photograph was taken. So it's quarrying on a massive scale. This is a close-up of the region. I've overlaid 3 things here. The pale blue is the extent of China clay quarrying and the dumping of the waste. And then the hatched orange are areas that I've surveyed since 2011, so all of them cumulatively. And the red dots are where we have GPS locations of Marsupella profunda. So what I've done here is just to take out the area of the region to focus in on that a bit better. So I've covered 947 hectares of the region cumulatively over the last 13 years, and that's 23% of the quarrying area of this particular region. I've recorded 3,954 individual equivalents of Marsupella profunda, so remember that's occupied 1 metre grid cells. And from that, I estimate that the total population across this region is somewhere in the region of 10 to 20,000 individual equivalents presently. And you can see from the distribution pattern here that it's locally frequent, but it's highly clustered. So the question arises, why? What is causing that high clustering? So I'll try to explain that by looking at this image. So I'm stood here on top of one of the tips, and I'm overlooking an area of the region. This is Higher Moor Pit here, and this is Gun Heath Pit. These areas here, you can see this green field here, this green field here, that's the original landscape, the Cornish landscape, before there was any quarrying. These areas have not been impacted by the China clay quarrying. So it was rolling pasture here before there was any China clay quarrying. And the quarrying activity, in essence, they dig down, blast down into the quarry to find the kaolinite, the colonised granite. That's washed out by basically a huge jet wash. It's merely washed out of the granite. They take the China clay away and they dump the waste. So for every ton of china clay you get out of this quarrying, there are 4 tons of waste, and they simply dump that in the surrounding landscape. It used to be dumped in these conical hills up until the 1980s, and that gave the local region the nickname the Cornish Alps. But they became illegal in the 1980s because they were prone to collapse. Since then, a lot of them were reformed then, and ever since then, any new china clay waste is dumped in these long whale-backed hills. And once a resource is exhausted in a pit, it simply becomes disused, it becomes flooded, and they move on to the next quarryable area. So how does Marsupella profunda distribute itself across this landscape? Well, these tips, it tends to occur in fairly small amounts, if at all, because there's usually not a lot of soft granite boulders on them. These tips, these conical tips in particular, tend to be composed almost entirely of coarse sand, of coarse granite sand, which the species never occurs on. But occasionally some sides of these tips can have soft granite boulders, and the species will occur on them. So it does occur on them, but not in great abundance, and it's usually quite localized. Conversely, this pit here, Higher Moor, is an absolute hotspot for Marsupella profunda. So the quarrying has gone back to the soft granite rocks, and all along here, this part of the pit has soft granite exposures still after china clay quarrying ceased. So it's a disused pit, that's important. It tends not to occur in much abundance in currently quarried pits because there's just too much disturbance. Quarrying is disused, but it's not too far in the distance past in that it hasn't become overgrown by scrub yet. So it's non-operational, but recently abandoned. There's lots of soft granite rock still exposed, and that provides superb habitat for Marsupella profunda, and there's an enormous population in Higher Moor Pit. So that leads you to think, when you look down onto Gunheath Pit, you can see a lot of exposed granite here, a lot of exposed granite all the way around here, all the way around here, all up here. And you think, there's a good chance of Marsupella profunda being down there. But I've surveyed all of this landscape in detail, and there is profunda within Gunheath Pit, but there's not a lot of it, because all of this exposed granite is hard granite. There's a bit of it on soft granite here and a bit over here, but there's very little of it about. So those clusters you saw on the previous map are areas of inactive pits, recently abandoned, and which still have a lot of soft granite about. So what of its long-term history in Britain? Well, as I say, it was recorded by Jean Payton firstly in 1990, and the earliest record that's been able to be traced through herbarium records is from 1965. There's nothing earlier than that. So you think, well, is it a recent arrival, or is it a long-term resident? And there are 4 main scenarios that seem possible. So under its possibility of being a long-term resident, it may, prior to china clay quarrying, it may have occupied natural exposures of the unaltered hard granite, and that those have subsequently been lost to china clay quarrying. But I think that's highly doubtful, because firstly, hard granite isn't its preferred substrate, and secondly, there's vast amounts of hard granite across Cornwall, and the species has never been recorded away from china clay pits. So I think that's rather unlikely. The other option is that it predates china clay quarrying activity in Cornwall, and that it occupied natural exposures of soft kaolinized granite. Now, problem with that is that we don't know whether there were exposures of the soft granite prior to quarrying activity. There could have been, for example, along stream valleys, for example, but we simply don't know, and it would have been highly localized, I think. So the second option, second set of options rather, is surrounds whether it's a recent arrival. So there's a possibility that it's been introduced by humans recently, but I think that's highly unlikely. Firstly, because of its global distribution. It's a rare species globally. Even in Portugal, where it's been known from the longest, it's highly localized there, and it seems quite unlikely that someone will pick it up on their clothing and then subsequently end up in a china clay pit in Cornwall. You might think, well, possibly it's been brought by quarrying machinery or quarrying people who have travelled between Portugal and Cornwall. But there's very little china clay quarrying that occurs in Portugal. It's not a big industry at all. So unlike in Cornwall, where it's massive. So I think that's unlikely as well. It seems as though that perhaps the most likely is that once china clay quarrying took off in Cornwall, it created vast amounts of good habitat for the species, and the species subsequently colonised via spore dispersal from Portugal. But this is, this is pure speculation, and that's all we can do based on the evidence we have at the moment. And what we need is some good molecular biogeographic studies to help us understand its possible history in Britain. I'm running a bit late on time here, so I've only got a couple of slides left. Firstly, about its future prospects. As I've mentioned, I think it will be extinct in West Cornwall within the next 20 years, and I don't think there's a lot we can do about that. In the St. china clay region, this graph here shows china clay production in Cornwall. Reached a peak in the late 1980s and has since undergone a catastrophic decline, 75% decline since its peak. Reasons for that is cheaper china clay from Brazil mainly, but also competition from alternative products for which china clay is used, such as white pigments in paper, for example. Talk to people in the china clay industry about its potential future in Cornwall, and people just don't know. But nobody's optimistic about china clay production. And whilst there's still a lot quarried, I think the situation seems as though the decline will continue. And the implications for Marsupella profunda, of course, is that there's going to be less habitat in the future. And we can see that already in the eastern parts of the china clay region. They're being redeveloped gradually, in particular for housing, for solar energy farms, and for transport infrastructure. So its potential habitat within that, its core region, is shrinking. These latter 2 points are kind of offer it a bit of chance for its future, in that some of the old pits are being reworked for secondary aggregates, such as granite rock or sand, but that's fairly low key, and these secondary aggregates are bulky and they're not worth a lot of money, so they're only economically suitable for local use. So it's never going to occur on a big scale, the secondary aggregate resource. Last one is lithium, and that does offer it with significant potential future possibilities, in that this is so lithium production will begin in china clay pits in 2027 from Trevally pit. So that's going to be reworking an old china clay pit, and it will be that's Cornish Lithium who will be starting that, and then a much bigger area which will start production in 2030. That's a separate company British lithium, and they're reworking these old china clay pits. So that's going to provide it with the disturbance it requires and the re-exposure of soft granite substrates. So it's an uncertain future there for it. So lastly, three main conclusions, and apologies, I'm now on 40 minutes. So three main conclusions to take away. Attempts to protect and manage land for the conservation of Marsupella profunda by the conservation agencies have completely failed, as I've illustrated. It simply isn't a species which the conservation community is capable of conserving. Second conclusion, the enormous financial value of the china clay resource, which is still worth £125 million a year, is the main factor that drives the maintenance of suitable habitat for this species in Britain. And thirdly, the long-term survival of the species in Britain is simply not within the control of conservation agencies, but is entirely dependent on the uncertain future of china clay quarrying. So on to some acknowledgements. Many thanks to Natural England for funding this work, and many thanks to these, in particular these 6 people, for the help and assistance during the project. And apologies once again for overrunning, and I hope you have a good conference for the rest of the day. Thank you very much for listening. Bye now.